I'll talk a little bit first about DocuSign and my role at DocuSign, and then I'll get into the crux of my brief talk today, which is delivering on the promise of workforce transformation. So first, who is DocuSign and what do we stand for? Most people know DocuSign as the world's #1 e-signature company, which is absolutely at the core of what we do. But our comprehensive capabilities actually help governments and private companies around the world automate and connect the entire document management process. DocuSign was founded in 2003, and within the past quarter, we actually celebrated our 1 millionth global customer and 1 billionth global user. And so everything that we do really aligns to three pillars, specifically as it relates to our government relationships. The first is trust, certainly demonstrably providing examples of how our commitment to trust, specifically as it relates to agencies with mission critical initiatives, are reliant on privacy and security and compliance. The second is innovation, also known as what we call the reimagination of experiences. And then finally, social impact. First, acknowledging and addressing the digital divide. Second is accessibility, beginning with that in mind to ensure that even individuals with disabilities are able to fully participate and thrive in what we call the new anywhere economy. And then finally, sustainability, a full-throated commitment to reducing reliance of our customers and our own company on paper and reducing our global carbon footprint. So with that said, I'll tell you a little bit quickly about myself. My name is Michael Jackson, affectionately known at DocuSign as MJ, and I've been with the company for just under a year as the global head of industries, meaning I lead a team that brings to market solutions specifically for regulated industries, including public sector, healthcare, life sciences, and financial services. So with that said, you may wonder, okay, why are we talking about workforce transformation at a government conference on electronic records management and modernizing it? So before we get there, I'll start with a level set definition of workforce transformation. It's a cliche, it's a buzzword, it means different things to different people, but for purposes of today, it is the method of improving an organization's skills, tools, and abilities to optimize and adapt to changes in its environment, culture, and mission. So I'm going to repeat that: environment, culture, and mission, because we're going to go relatively deep in the 20 minutes that I have on each of those three topics. We're going to work backwards from the environment, the external factors which impact the culture of an organization and sometimes influences shifts in its mission. So, any examples of current environmental disruptors? That's what we're going to get into now. Very quickly though, like I said, my agenda is going to be brief. 3 buckets of content or areas of discussion that I'm going to touch on. Number 1, opportunity and disruption, which is going to speak to the environment. The cost of doing nothing, which is I think a great summary sometimes of how governments are forced to opt for status quo when they are faced with unlimited challenges, competing priorities, but finite resources. And then finally, innovation and practice. That'll talk a bit about the mission, and I'll provide real world examples of departments and agencies that are doing what I'm about to describe. So first, let's talk about the environment, the external factors that are creating disruption that, if you look close enough, actually are presenting opportunities. Now, I mentioned before, why are we talking about workforce transformation at a government conference about ERM? Well, 85% of business processes, and this is according to Gartner, begin with a form. And many of those forms end up as agreements or files or contracts or records that have to be mentioned. Now, you combine that with the fact that as the country's largest employer, the US government employs more than 2 million people. And that's why we're talking about workforce transformation at a government conference about electronic records management. So what we're looking at on the screen right now is a traditional employment life cycle. Starts with recruitment. You find a great pool of candidates, you onboard them. Over time, development occurs and promotions, and then ultimately retirement. I mean, that's how it worked for both my parents. Both my parents are retired public servants. My mom worked for CMS. My dad's a retired corrections officer. And their career spanned, both of them, 30, 40 plus years, and it looked exactly like what you see on the screen. Now, each of those steps are, immersed in processes, mostly paper-based during that time, mostly manual, mostly laden with errors due to that manual data entry. But that is basically a person's life. Millions of people's professional lives can be summed up in what you see on the top half of your screen. What you see on the bottom half, though, are those external influencers, all that are happening right now, today, simultaneously. And so agencies and other employers are adapting, and many are grappling with some of these. I'm just going to walk through them really quickly. So first, let's think about recruitment. And we talk about laws of attraction. So, it's no secret that as young people enter the workforce, many of them have conditioned expectations about how easy things should work, what experiences should feel like as consumers, as constituents, and as employees. And so the government actually finds itself competing with the private sector to lure the talent into their pool of employees. Secondly, I don't have to tell you about work from anywhere. I mean, the past 2 years have taught us, if nothing else, that hybrid is just the beginning. I mean, many agencies are still grappling with how to bring people back into the office safely. But beyond that, I think once the genie is out of the bottle, it's kind of hard to go back from an expectations perspective. And then there's the Great Resignation. I won't bore you with the details, but it took me about an hour last night. I was talking to my dad and I told him a little bit about this presentation, and I was trying to get him to understand or empathize with the Great Resignation. He didn't get it, and I gave up. But it's real, right? It's real. I think as people are beginning to have the opportunity to work from home through necessity, many are finding that they don't want to go back unless the environment that they're returning to has changed, and they're looking for a better sense of belonging or worth or opportunities for advancement. All of those things are contributing to what we call the Great Resignation. And then finally, not finally, but next up is the second act. The second act speaks to mid-career development that sometimes happens out of a sense of accomplishment or wanting to promote one's skills, but sometimes it's out of necessity, as individuals find that their current skills, their current roles are being augmented or replaced in some cases. And so that's a real disruptor as well. And then finally, brighter horizons. Now, every day in this country, 10,000 people celebrate their 65th birthday. So as a population, we are living longer, but we also find that people are aspiring to retire early as well. The youngest cohort, Generation Y, currently ages 25 to 40, they plan to retire at an average age of 59. 59. So if throughout the entire employment life cycle, you're concurrently facing all of these challenges, how do you find the opportunity? There is definitely disruption, but where's the opportunity? That's what we're going to talk about next. But first, I want to focus a little bit on what I call the cost of doing nothing. So I mentioned laws of attraction previously, attracting and even competing for talent, excuse me. So in the private sector, there's a saying that goes, if you don't take care of your customer, somebody else will. And that's pretty true. In the government, however, the mission is to take care of everybody. And so sometimes even the most vulnerable don't have choices. And so that's what I meant earlier when I say if you have competing priorities and a finite pool of resources, too often governments find that their alternative to digital transformation is business as usual. or status quo. And that does come with a cost. That's what we call the cost of doing nothing. Take this, for example. According to the White House Office of Innovation and Regulatory Affairs, the federal government spends $38.7 billion a year just managing paperwork, such as records and forms, surveys, and other types of written agreements. There are 23,000 unique forms currently in use across 66 government agencies that deal with the public, around half of which are paper-only or printable-only forms that require manual processing. So to put that into perspective, as you look on your screen, if there were a federal Department of Paperwork, it would have the 7th largest budget of any government agency, bigger than Treasury, EPA, NASA, and many other agencies. And so each year, individuals and businesses spend 11 billion hours on government forms, reading instructions, printing them out, filling them out, sending them in, often by mail, and correcting errors. So you can see the cost to the public is pretty significant. Sometimes I think being short-sighted, and this is not a jab at the government at all. I mean, I certainly appreciate all that the agencies deliver and the personal sacrifices of many of the public servants. But when you assign a cost to the status quo, it almost becomes a no-brainer. At that point, it's like, okay, how do we do it? And I actually jotted down a quote from the previous speaker, Jeanette Plant, when she said, change doesn't happen until people feel pain. And sometimes the pain is just acknowledging or understanding or realizing the cost that's being spent on doing nothing. I mean, when you think about it, status quo is very costly, and it allocates or it absorbs our most valuable resource, and that is time. So let's go forward and dig into that a little more. 23,000 forms maintained by 68 agencies, 11.3 billion hours spent annually, and 150 billion in cost to the public. So there's definitely a cost to doing nothing. But what does that look like? How could we possibly end up with such a significant cost? I mean, it's one thing to see it on paper, but what does the actual flow look like? I'm going to share the workflow of one of our customers. This is the workflow of USDA before we started to work with them. And this shows just a correspondence management workflow, which ultimately ended up in the deliverance of correspondence to the public and then retention of records of that correspondence internally. Now, I won't walk through every single step, but you can see from reviews from editorial reviews to technical reviews, redlining, deputy directors' edits. I mean, there were a lot of back and forth. And if this is a paper-based process, not only is the record retention susceptible to fire and flood, but like I said, the time that gets invested in this process when it's multiplied millions of times per year gets to add up pretty quickly. And this is just to manage one correspondence. The process or derivative of it happens every time inbound correspondence occurs, thousands of times a day. Again, the cost of doing nothing is certainly not nothing. So now let's shift our focus and talk about what it looks like to address the mission, to address the challenges that are happening to these agencies as they look to employ workforce transformation, both across the enterprise, despite the external factors, and overcoming the cost of doing nothing. What does it look like when innovation is actually put into practice? Well, we like to say it's time to change the way we even think about securely managing records. And at the core of everything we do, like I said, is first earning trust, demonstrably exhibiting our commitment to privacy, security, and compliance. And so our approach to this, specifically in the federal market, allows us to offer a trusted, fast, and easy way that enables citizens to access the services they need and employees to manage the back-end processes from within the organizations, the departments, and the agencies. In addition to functionality, We have, like I said, e-signature is at the core of everything we do. I started by saying that. And this is not intended to be a sales pitch, but instead to broaden the understanding of how just digitizing content, digitizing forms and records really is the first step. First, the records and the management of those records, when digital, is improved exponentially by modernizing it to that degree. But at the end of the day, a form or a record that's been digitized is essentially just a picture of what was once paper. To effectively manage those digitized records, we have to think about collaboratively allowing role-based access to those records, and then overlaying artificial intelligence so that trends may be identified, access trends, usage trends, or even data trends buried in the records themselves. How can we pull insights out of millions of records to identify trends of what has happened in the past and accurately predict what's likely to happen in the future? And so we have 3 discrete incremental steps in that modernization. The first is digitization. The second is collaboration, allowing multiple parties access, again, based on their role, their need to access, but doing it in a way that is extremely secure. And then finally, overlaying our artificial intelligence so that we can have a smart environment. So some examples of that. Some examples of the compliance and the regulations that are considered as we develop and bring these types of things to market include programs that we help our customers to satisfy or exceed, whether it's HIPAA or CGIS, FTI with IRS 1075. I won't walk you through, I won't read all these slides because of time constraints, and probably because most of the audience is somewhat familiar with these anyway. But again, I wanted to at least lay the groundwork so that when we talk about incrementally improving these manual paper-laden processes, beyond just digitizing, beyond just acquiring a legally binding electronic signature, how can we modernize the entire process? And this is what that process looks like. Most people, like I said, are familiar with DocuSign as the world's leading e-signature solution. But prior to signing a form or an agreement or a record, that document needs to be prepared. And so we help our customers to prepare automatically, automating manual tasks, orchestrating complex workflows, and eliminating unnecessary risk by ingesting content from external sources and automatically populating and generating content into the form or agreement or contract or record before it even acquires the signature. And then oftentimes after the signature is obtained, there are actions that need to be initiated almost automatically sometimes, whether it's assigning a caseworker or collecting payment, you name it. Possibilities really are endless, but we can help to automate that as well. And then finally, managing the millions of signed and executed agreements, forms, surveys, contracts, and records, and overlaying that repository with artificial intelligence to pull insights that would otherwise be buried in millions of pages of paper. So this is what it looks like in practice. I'll give you just a few examples, one at the federal level, one at the state and local level, and then I'll talk about a current initiative as it relates to records management. First, at the federal level, DocuSign was proud to play a role in the integrated systems that enabled HRSA to expedite its distribution of $175 billion in grants for the Provider Relief Fund. Now, according to Adrienne Burton, she's the CIO of HRSA, she said they had been using DocuSign for onboarding already to make it easier as new hires sign off on forms electronically. But because they were already doing that and they had an ATO, an authority to operate, in place for that, they were also able to quickly create an ATO for the Provider Relief Fund. So again, oftentimes, I'll go back to that quote, change doesn't happen until people feel pain. Obviously, the pandemic has created a lot of pain in a lot of ways across the country and around the world. Nothing compares to, obviously, the loss of life. But when you think about the business continuity aspects of mission critical agencies that just don't have the luxury of turning the lights out, agencies and departments that had already began to explore modernization through this process found it a lot easier to shift and employ new use cases for some of the transformation that they were already starting to implement. Another example is the New Mexico Educational Retirement Board. So every year, the board processes close to 300,000 records as members go through the employment lifecycle. Before DocuSign, everything was on paper. It typically took 2 weeks or longer for a document such as a retirement application to get from the member to the employer and finally back to the board to be processed and scanned for digital record keeping. Adding to the complexity, applications had an extremely high return rate due to errors, sometimes as high as 70%. And that extended turnaround time by weeks in some cases. And so the agency, the board, wanted to reduce that timeline and make things better for their members, more efficient for the retiring employees, and just an overall better experience. And the result, after partnering with DocuSign, clearly was accelerating the average retirement processing time from 2 weeks to 2 days. And again, that understands that most processes begin with a form and they end with some sort of an agreement or a record or a case or some iteration that needs to be archived and managed. Now, finally, for the initiative that I wanted to talk about, returning to work. This is something that's been on top of mind for many federal agencies and private employers as well. A couple weeks ago, the US federal government and a number of state and local governments also started requiring proof of vaccination or mandatory weekly COVID testing before allowing employees in-person access to facilities. And OSHA is currently developing a rule that will extend these requirements to all employers with 100 or more employees. So obviously agencies were looking for a quick, efficient, and automated solution to manage this process. And as an example, one large county who prefers to remain unnamed, I'll be happy to share offline, but don't want to be named publicly. But this one large county recently sent vaccination status requests to more than 20,000 employees in a single weekend and achieved an incredible 90% response rate by partnering with DocuSign. So again, oftentimes it's the pain that is felt, the catalyst, that immediate need, which sparked or served as a catalyst for modernization. And again, once the genie's out of the bottle, once the toothpaste is out of the tube, it's almost impossible to go back, not just because of an experience perspective, but because of the cost savings and the mitigated risk as well. But it's not just about workforce transformation. Actually, you can see in the lower left corner of your screen, there are lots of use cases, obviously, as it relates to the employment lifecycle, managing that, modernizing that, transforming that, if you will. But across the federal government, we've got thousands of customers who are using DocuSign and similar tools, but specifically DocuSign as it relates to modernizing just not the secure electronic acquisition of signatures, but modernizing the entire workflow. As it relates to workforce transformation, that's from recruitment to retirement, and through all of the disruptors that we're experiencing in between today. So what does that look like? Over 10 years of working with our government and defense customers, you can see just a small fraction. I mentioned at the beginning of the session, we've been working with 1 million customers, 1 billion users, and many, many, many of those are trusted government relationships at the federal, state, and local level. So with that, I'm going to thank everyone for your time. I really appreciated the ability to spend this bit of time. I mentioned it was the most valuable resource that we all have. Obviously, the topic of workforce transformation would take up an entire conference if we had it, but I just hopefully scratched the surface enough to whet your appetite and explore ways that you may be able to employ some of these tactics in your own agencies.
Excellent. MJ, thank you very much for that. And as luck would have it, we've got a whole workshop on workforce coming up in November. So maybe we can return to this conversation there.
I would like that. Absolutely.
Yeah, I am going to have to steer questions to offline, but the contact information is here for MJ or in the chat room here later this morning. But thank you very much for a great presentation. Yeah,
and I will receive any correspondence if you send it to return to work at DocuSign.